Tim, thank you for joining us on Scotland Tonight. We will talk about the book in a minute, but seeing as we've got you here, I'd just like to ask you, how serious do you think the situation is between the UK and Russia?
This is a watershed month in the relationship. It's a watershed month in the relationship between the UK and Russia, the UK and the other European Union countries, both of those and Russia. This is multifaceted, and the response to what it is alleged has happened, and because there's still a couple of weeks left in this month, and what plays out over the next couple of weeks will shape the relationship for years to come. You cannot overestimate how important this is.
So when people draw comparisons with the Cold War, they're not exaggerating?
I don't think so. I've actually said for about 5 years we're in a form of new Cold War. I mean, it's because it's not exactly like the old Cold War, because times have changed and there is no more Warsaw Pact or USSR. But for a broad brush term, I've been arguing for years we've been there. If you take the fall of the Berlin Wall, the difficulties that happened after that as Russia began, well, collapsed and then staggered back to its feet. By the time you get to the invasion of Georgia, 2006, which they were provoked, but they still invaded a country. Then they invaded part of Ukraine. Then they annexed part of Ukraine. We've got the Litvinenko poisoning a few years ago. We've got the Russian jets flying straight towards UK airspace, subs in Swedish waters, and more than anything, disinformation campaigns trying to wheedle Russian influence into the Western world. I think we've been there for 5 years. I think it's taken this incident to reveal just how bad the relationship is.
And what do you think the long-term
Well, again, that does depend on what happens now. But you look at these expulsions, and some people are saying, oh, yeah, it's not that serious a deal to expel that many. It is. The biggest ever expulsions of what were essentially spies were, I think it was in the early 60s, and it was about 100. But that was only about a fifth of the staff at the embassy. This number that's been expelled at the moment from the embassy in London is about 40% of the embassy. I mean, it is a serious message to the Russians. We'll see what follows up with things such as whether they're really going to go after some of the money, the really dirty money that washes around in London. And then on the Russian side, well, what's going to be the response? It'll be manifold, many varied. And I'm pretty sure we will see more tests of British airspace. We will see more naval activity. We will see more disinformation. It doesn't have to get any worse, but at the moment, relations are worse than cool, and for the foreseeable future, that is going to remain that way. Mr. Putin must have national fervour behind him to back him up. It's election week. He needs to harness that national fervour and keep it going. OK, let's talk about the book now. The world is divided by more physical walls now than at any time since World War II. Why are we living in an age of walls? Well, that's the question, isn't it? Because the what is what's going on, and that was actually the easy bit of the book. The what is that 65 countries have walled or fenced themselves off from their neighbours. That's over a third of all the countries in the world are now walled off from their neighbours. And of all the walls built since the Second World War, more than half of them have gone up this century. So after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, as we thought, oh, it's going to be sweetness and light. In fact, the world has divided. Sorry, which brings me to your excellent question.
It is a big question.
Which, of course, is much harder to answer. The why has this happened? Now, for me, it's an unpalatable truth, the answer. Some people think it's unpalatable even to talk about it. I am pretty convinced the major reason, and there are many, is the mass movement of peoples. As simple as that. Yes, there's drug running, weapons smuggling, all sorts of things, but it's the mass movement of peoples.
And do you think that's a common theme in all these different parts of the world?
Well, yeah, and again, it's a mistake to think of this as a European issue solely, or just that Trump's wall of the USA-Mexico relationship. I mean, those are obviously big things that need to be looked at and discussed, but it's a mistake to view these divisions that are happening just for those, because it's global. A very good example, India has fenced off almost the entirety of Bangladesh, 2,500 miles of it, almost all of it now fenced off. Electric barriers, razor wire, searchlights, lasers, you name it. And that's because over the past 17 years, 15 million Bangladeshis have moved across the border into India. It's upset the equilibrium of those border states. It's led to rioting. It's led to serious social tensions. And the Indian response has been, get the border up. So, you know, it's a mistake to think that it's only the Europeans that are doing this in response to what happened in 2014. It's happening everywhere. Saudi Arabia has completely fenced off Iraq. That's more to do with terrorism, but it is also about the movement of peoples.
And of course, we can see from President Trump in America with his US-Mexico wall, the idea appeals to people.
I'm afraid it does. I mean, that particular wall I don't think would work. Because of the dynamics of the border between Mexico and the USA, there's a much easier way than tunneling under a wall or whatever. You simply, the drug gangs can simply control one of the border towns, and that way you just kill a few people and pay off a few people. You can get people through a lot more easily than you can by trying to smuggle them under a wall and across a desert. Which brings me to, well, in that case, what's the wall about? And that wall is very much about psychology. And there is part of the demographic that voted for Trump, and only part of it, that likes the idea of a wall, makes them think that something is being done about the issue which they care about. And I think what he will do is try to reduce the immigration figures coming from the south in various ways, build a little bit of concrete and say, see, job done. And psychologically it might be enough. Other areas where walls could be argued to work is very much which side of the wall you're on, Rona. Israel-Palestine, very, very difficult subject. If you're on the Israeli side of the wall, you're thinking to yourself, there are hundreds of people who are still alive, that kids, women, children, you name it, that would have been blown up by suicide bombings, because there were hundreds that died from suicide bombings. The wall went up, and they have massively reduced. But of course, if you're on the other side of that wall, you're thinking this wall is not working. It is stopping me from having a decent life. It is impacting on everything. It means I can't basically escape. I can't travel. There's no work for me. So many of the walls, your perspective depends on which side of it you're on.
And the UK leaving the EU, or, you know, our Brexit, is that a kind of metaphorical wall?
We thought, firstly, when the Berlin Wall came down, we're all going to cuddle up to each other. In fact, what has happened is that one of the union members are leaving. Several of the others have put fences up between them, Hungary, for example. And within the EU, there's all sorts of fractures going on. There's the Visegrad group of Eastern and Central European countries, which act as a bloc, Scandinavians acting as a bloc. The inner core of the French and Germans and the Benelux countries will now be pushing for ever closer union, but only for a few of the countries that will go with it. So we're about to enter a multi-speed era of the EU. And Europe, I'm afraid the great dream that we would subsume our national identities into a greater European identity has not got the traction required for us to think of ourselves as firstly European. I'm not making a case for or against it. I'm just making the point that it hasn't happened.
You said at the beginning of the interview that you thought, you know, the immigration, growing population is the main reason for the walls going up. And, you know, population is just going to get bigger and bigger. So walls are going to keep getting built then, aren't they? Is that what you see the way, what it's going to be like in the future? Again,
we go back to unpalatable truths. And again, I'm not making a case for or against mass immigration. I understand the arguments that we need it because of jobs. I understand the argument that it needs to be very carefully managed because people's lives have been changed quite rapidly, and I understand if they feel anxious about their culture and their lives, and they're fed up with being sneered at by people in Westminster and in general media terms, that if they're a little uncomfortable about pace of change, people think the worst of them instead of trying to understand them. But mass migration is not going to stop. It's going to come from the south to the north. Africa's population will almost double in the next 50 years. And I haven't got a solution. If I had, I'd be President of the United States. Mind you, he hasn't got one either. But I've got a phrase in the book. If we don't move a lot more of the money to where most of the people are, many of those people will move. And so the walls and the barriers will only be partially successful. You've got to build up these areas. You've got to have a greater distribution of wealth Because if we don't redistribute wealth more evenly across the globe, people from where there isn't that much money will move to where it is.
It's a prospect, isn't it? We'll have to leave it there, but Marshall, thank you very much indeed for joining us.